Hello everyone, welcome to the Whiteboard. Today we're going to have a short discussion on patterns and on anti-patterns, the antithesis, or so you would think. I'll just be straightforward and say we're going to skip the kindergarten discussion on, hey, it's an organization of shapes, it's a frequency of numbers, right? Or of colors. I'm not going to do different colors, but we're going to skip all this effectively and define that patterns are going to be some kind of repetition or arrangement. I'll go ahead and write that out because it applies whether you're talking about cybersecurity or you're talking about anything else. It really does come down to the arrangement, organization, composition, whatever, or the repetition of said things. Repetition of data in a particular order can indicate one kind of pattern. So that is an important thing if you think about it inside of cybersecurity, because many times when we're performing our primary tradecraft, we're looking at patterns. Frequently at everything from a low to a very high level. And I love examples, so let me do a few. Just keep in mind, everything with patterns is arrangement and repetition. And before I go down that road, let's just talk about a couple things. So what are patterns that you might hear of or see in cybersecurity? How about attack patterns? I'm sure you've heard of these. These are generally behavioral patterns that you will define. How they got in, how they got out, what they exfilled, how they did it. MITRE's framework does a great job. It's attack framework. Does a great job of this kind of information at a strategic or very high level. And it's a normal kind of attack pattern that we might run into as cybersecurity professionals. Behavioral patterns, period, whether I'm using them in MITRE's attack framework or not, or if I'm using behavioral patterns in, say, threat hunting, are something we would define. What's the basic genesis and the very core of threat hunting? That's creating a hypothesis, maybe more than one, and then defending it. And in the case of threat hunting, you go out and say, if I think that I have ransomware, you would go look for evidence, or you would look for facts that you can infer support this particular hypothesis of ransomware occurring. Or if you think you've been breached, you think you've had a data leak, everything begins with a hypothesis and then you build on it. Very simple. Threat hunting kind of pattern, basically using behavior. Why behavior? Well, if someone is an insider, for example, an insider moving around on the network is completely different than someone who's an outsider moving around on the network. An insider knows the ins and outs of the network. They know where to go, how to get there, and they do it very quickly. They don't have to fumble, explore, or research their way to say where the data store is or how to authenticate. They know already. And that speediness of their movement and the fact that they have to move, they can move there with very little grasping in the dark makes it very easy to sort of indicate that, hey, those are enough of a fact, of behavioral facts, that I can infer that they are an insider versus an outsider. I'll go to a different level. Another pattern that you'll run into and hear about frequently is like a security design pattern. This is a very strategic level pattern. Something that someone who's defining your program as an SME or as your CISO or security officer, they may do a lot of security patterns and talk about those. And I'll touch on those here a little bit more. A different type of a pattern, I could go on forever, but that's not as useful. Let's talk about tactical patterns. because I really want to talk tactical and strategic patterns and some operational patterns, because you'll see that level of granular. So when I say tactical, I mean granular, very down in the weeds, very much looking at grains of sand. And a great example of that would be Yara, which is a pattern matching tool that runs a command line or can be integrated into products that allows you to look for patterns in files. And you can look at patterns in files statically, like where it is at rest on a file system, or dynamically where it's in memory, including whether it's inside of network traffic, because you can use Yara to look at net flow. And so Yara is a way that you might define a pattern. In that case, the patterns you're defining here are very granular, and they tend to be done in either ASCII or hex, or in C-style notation. Let's leave it there. These two are your primary ways, at least in Yara, simplicity doing so. It has many things that it can do, but short, if I want to look at a granular level different patterns, I would use Yara as an example to look inside of a file. I could just as easily open up terminal and type grep or type awk and look at things that way, and search not only by the file name, but also inside the file itself for matches for what I'm looking for, using something called a regular expression, which is a way to describe a pattern inside of basically text. So you can see that this would be very useful at a granular level. Is this malicious? I might define a Yara rule or a regex match pattern to look for activity, and do so at a tactical level. If I wanted to be more operational, another cybersecurity pattern would be a Sigma rule, which defines behavior. And a lot of this is aimed at your SIEM, which is your clearinghouse for logs from all your security tools and devices, hopefully, on your network, all pouring into one place, one portal, one location to access all that information, so you don't have to go out and effectively query each one to get a composite picture of what's going on. I might want to use a Sigma rule to define an operational pattern of detection or discovery, and that is very behavioral based, where you might look at, say, a particular log type and gain from it log IDs that are being generated that are determined to match a series of conditions. And that could be as simple as the log on your machine says, hey, someone accessed a share from this particular device. So let's just write this out. So we might have in here, as an example, the device accesses a share, and this will all be usually tied up in one ID, that then lists all the files on that share, and then begins renaming them. This would be a snub or a snippet of something that looks for a ransomware event happening. Because what does ransomware do? It will figure out where all the files are on your operating system or on a share that you have attached. It will list all the files. It will then rename all the files after it hashes them all and begins to encrypt them. But you can check for those steps, and if this was done within, say, a very short amount of time, then you have a very decent match, or at least a basic match to one part of a ransomware event. And you might cut that machine off your network, or you might take other actions. That's kind of an after things. The pattern, though, would be defined this way. This is a series of behaviors tied together in a arrangement or sequence of time. All this has to happen, let's say, within seconds of each other, and it has to happen in a particular order. It has to be accessed. A full file listing has to be done, like it has to be alphabetized from A to Z. All the files have to be listed, And then, like so, access, sort, list, or access list, sort, rename. At that point, you probably have a ransomware event, especially if you have renaming, mass renaming happening really quickly. Absolutely. And so you'd have an operational pattern that you can define that way using Sigma. And I'll put links to Yara, Sigma, and so on in the description. A strategic level pattern that you would see is like the security design pattern that I mentioned. And it's funny, the strategic level use of the word pattern in cybersecurity is always interesting to me because they tend to step away a little bit from what I consider the classical definition of arrangement or repetition. Because an example security design pattern that you'll hear referred to is like single point of access. They're like, nope, there's only going to be one way in. All these other ones are going to be blocked. You have to go here. It doesn't matter where you're at. Everybody has to go to the single point. You get in here. VPN, remote, not on VPN, or on VPN, not on VPN, but remote, in office, whatever the situation, you only get in through going to this one gateway. Single point of access. They consider this a pattern. It sort of is true, right? You're forcing all these things to one location. So to me, it's a fringe use of the word pattern, but it does apply, and it is commonly referred to that way in our industry. Same thing for defense in depth or layers of security. That is more traditional pattern because you're talking about an arrangement. This could also be classically an arrangement, but again, it's on the fringes for me. Now, I only want to touch briefly on patterns because patterns are part of what we do, our tools, our attribution that we perform. So tools, our trade crafts, our tools, the attribution, the analysis and logic we use is all based on patterns. So you should be very familiar with them. For example, an attack pattern is basically the steps someone takes to achieve, initial access, let's say. These might be preceding steps. You might define an attack pattern this way. You might say this is email, or this could be a file download, or whatever it might be. You break out these steps. Knowing this allows you to define a pattern that you can then put in your tools or perform analysis against or use logic for. Behavioral patterns the same way. It kind of goes on and on and on. We use patterns day in and day out. Get used to that fact and get used to using that terminology. Now, I mentioned that I would touch on, one, I'd keep this relatively short, and two, I'd talk about anti-patterns. Now, to me, this is kind of a misnomer, kind of a misnaming, but whatever, it works. A traditional anti-pattern, as an example, would be something that is accepted as a norm. It's based on intuition versus fact. And a classic example of an anti-pattern is security by obscurity. If they don't know who I am, there's no reason they would attack me. Can't tell you how many times I've heard that over the years. It does not work. Another anti-pattern, at least classically an anti-pattern, would be, I have nothing of value, so no one will attack me. That's an anti-pattern. This is really just a form of thought that is accepted as kind of a norm, but is absolutely incorrect or wrong. In fact, it will be misleading and misguiding in every way. Even though it may seem attractive and correct, it's an anti-pattern. And you'll see these in security. The two I mentioned are classic ones to me. Security by obscurity still being one. Another one might be that if I buy this product, I have protection. That does not work. Just gaining a product or buying a service does not provide protection. It's only the application and understanding of said item or said service that will provide you any layer of protection, and usually only over time. It'll take additional time for that to actually incorporate into your culture and into your way of doing business in order to be successful. So just a short snippet on patterns and anti-patterns and how they relate to cybersecurity. I hope you like this. Please click like if you did. If you like what you see, please join our channel and subscribe. There will be more and better soon whiteboard presentations and more slide deck information as we go through the journey of learning tradecraft in cybersecurity and threat intelligence, as well as some of the key features and interesting parts of our industry. Thank you for your time.